I think that's the reaction that a lot of people have to the Italian because it's such a cagey, slow opening to start with. But Daniel, it's also the most difficult one to face because there are all these little moves and little ideas like, does white include h2, h3? Does white include the a pawn moving forward to a4? Where and when does the bishop fall back? Is black first to strike in the center with d5, or does white get a central break in with d4? And usually it is a slow start, but once we see a central break in, things start to get spicy.
Definitely. Much like the Berlin, the Italian has this reputation as a boring opening. Where does that reputation come from? Because when it's played properly, and when two super GMs make a quick draw in an Italian, we assume it's easy. Then you sit down in front of the black piece and you're like, wait a second, what the heck do I do? We saw this in the CCT play, and Fabiano Caruana, one of the top Italian experts, he won a couple of games against GMs in like 20 moves. He beat Adam Kozak. A single inaccuracy, playing d5 at the wrong moment, playing bishop e6 at the wrong moment can cost you the game very quickly. So it's an opening with a lot of teeth. Right now, Magnus Carlsen is taking his time, queen to b3, not a very conventional approach to this position, forcing Alireza's rook back to f8. I am more used to seeing a pawn on b4 before the queen gets to b3. Try saying that 10 times in a row. Will this position appear on the board 10 times in a row?
The one thing that's a bit of a drawback with the queen moving from the d1 square is that the black knight can jump to h5 because you don't have these tactics of knight takes pawn on e5 because the queen from d1 would have then picked up the knight. So you always have to watch out for that black knight eventually landing on that f4 square, which is an idea that usually works in black's favor.
There's also a trap that I really like to point out. I'm going to put this on the board just so we can get a better hang of what's going on. Alireza has a lot of moves in this position. He can go king h8, h6. So it's hard to predict what he's going to do. If he plays knight h5, bishop to d5 sometimes runs into this really cool tactic. In this position, knight f4 is also good, but I just want to point out knight takes a5 is very commonly missed by top players. Rook takes a5. And then c6, opening up a double attack on the bishop and the rook. This is a trick that is found in the Gleck system from the white side. So I always like to point out these unconventional tactical patterns. Will Alireza play knight h5? Tanya, great call. It's on the board. And Firouzja wants to win this game. He doesn't just want to hold a draw. He senses that he's got the psychological advantage. He's got Magnus tilted. And let me tell you, queen b3, queen d1, queen b3, queen d1, not exactly my version of a successful Italian.
That's a clear sign that something has gone wrong in the opening. When you have to come back with the queen to the square d1 so quickly, things are not looking great. Knight f4 is an option. You're pointing out queen f6. I like both these moves. Very, very strange play here by Magnus, and I think Alireza should be more than happy with what he's gotten out of the opening. Daniel, I see a move on the board, by the way. I think he's gone for queen to f6. We see that on our live board on that bottom left. So great call by you there. And knight takes pawn now doesn't work because the queen can capture that knight, and then eventually its own knight is protected by the queen. So no tactics on the board. I don't think Magnus is happy with the way the opening's gone.
And there's another problem. If he plays knight h2, another typical idea in the Italian, there's knight h5 to g3, sending the rook away. So lots of tactical nastiness to keep in mind if you're white. Now, Magnus can kind of go for the nuclear option, just take this knight off the board. But then you're handing over the bishop pair. If you have to play bishop takes f4, it's a sign that you're worse and that things have gone wrong. Let me tell you, Tanya, he's worse and things have gone wrong.
This is a dream Italian with black. You've got everything that you want. Your knight has landed on f4. You're already threatening tactics once the queen arrives on g6. You've got checkmating ideas coming on the board. Bishop takes pawn is a massive threat right now. And Magnus Carlsen, with head in hands, is trying to deal with this and just wondering, how did he land up in this position? In what move are we on?
I'm going to get the live position here. Just a moment. There we go. Bishop e3 on the board. And wait a second. Bishop takes h3. He wants bishop takes f4. Let's put this on the analysis board. Can Alireza get away with this move? No, I don't think so. Bishop takes f4 is Magnus's idea. Tanya, this is such a devilish trap. Look at this. Queen takes f4. GH, you're feeling cool, you give a check on G3, and much like the first game, Alireza did this to disarm Magnus's attack. Here, the roles would be reversed. This knight on H2, for people trying to learn from these games, this is a very, very powerful defender. Alireza would run out of pieces. That's not possible. Maybe you can play knight takes H3, but I don't think so. I think if you're Firouzja, forget about the tactics, just play a move like bishop E6 and enjoy your life. Maybe
also very tempting to put that queen on G6. Yeah, I was just going to say, not only do you threaten a mate in one, bishop H3 becomes even more powerful. And then you've got to analyze what happens after white was to take that knight on F4. But Alireza, with a different approach, he wants to get another piece into the attack. He wants to get the knight from the queen side over to G6 to try to reinforce that knight on F4. It's given a question mark, but Daniel, to me, it doesn't feel like a bad move at all. I actually think it just keeps all the pressure and the threats in the position.
Yeah, the top engine move was G7, G5, which you don't see every day in the Italian. It's a very hard move to play against Magnus. Knight E7 is a very typical approach to the position, get the knight around to G6. And Magnus responds in textbook fashion. You get a piece out of the center. I try to punish you by striking in the center. I'm curious, though, what Magnus is intending against knight E7 to G6. How is he going to prosecute that tension in the center? Is he going to exchange on E5 and then exchange on A7? Will we see a move like king to H2 from Magnus, which is a really nice way of sidestepping these dangerous threats with knight takes H3? I think Firouzja senses that this is an important moment where he needs to keep that foot on the gas pedal. Otherwise, the momentum of the game might start shifting in Magnus's direction. I think it already has, actually, after a move like king H2, Tanya. And I'm not really seeing where Alireza's going with this knight. Maybe H4.
Well, the whole idea is that you kind of just reinforce that knight on F4, and at some point you want to jump onto H4 to take away a key defender in white's camp. The other thing that this knight maneuver does for black, a very typical plan in the Italian, is to push in the center, right? Now that the C6 square has been left empty, you could actually go C6, and if you can dream and try and get D5, that would be ideal. But I think at some point, Daniel, Magnus does intend to take on E5, making sure that Alireza doesn't get that D5 break in.
I got to shout you out, Tanya. I think you're pointing out a lot of correct things. C6, something I completely forgot about. That is a very important idea. And I think Alireza is going to operate in the center. Great call. Hats off to you. C6 is on the board. Firouzja is still very much in the driver's seat. And D5 is a force to be reckoned with if you're Magnus Carlsen, because that king on H2, Tanya, might very well get caught in the crossfire, right? You can imagine a scenario where white trades twice on E5 and suddenly the king is caught in a potential discovered check. Magnus is still worse. And he's a single blunder away from getting destroyed in the king side and on the center. In the center and on the king side. Wrong way around.
The thing is, right, Alireza is coming for the king, and you can't allow black to open up with D5, so have to trade on E5. And once again, to me, it is the most natural looking move, but it feels like the computer not happy, gives it an inaccuracy. Daniel, I really like your idea. Instead of taking it with the pawn, which feels like a hand move in this kind of position, to consolidate that knight on F4, reinforce it. Knight takes pawn would really put the pressure on Magnus. What do you think Alireza is going to decide on? Knight takes pawn or pawn takes pawn?
The fact that he's pausing here tells us he's not just automatically going to recapture the pawn. This is one of the things which makes these top players so good. They sense the moment when, wait a second, let me resist the urge to make the autopilot move. Let me go a little bit deeper into the position and find a more creative way to pose problems. I really like the look of knight takes e5 for two reasons. The first is, again, exploiting that vulnerable king position. The second reason, Tanya, is after knight e5, queen e5, you're immediately hitting the e4 pawn. You're saving the possibility of pushing d5. So even though the pawn on d6 is technically a weakness, it could very well turn into a strength if it's pushed one square forward. Magnus is walking on hot coals here, and let's see if he can handle the tension. I don't know. It's looking unpleasant.
And it's really not something anyone could have predicted at the start of the day, that we would be sitting here right now in one of the two rapid games of the grand final reset. Alireza with the black pieces and an advantage out of the opening. It might not be a big advantage, and we can see it, that objectively, it's still a balanced position. But think about it. You're playing with the white pieces. Black's knights are coming at you. The queen is so active. You feel like you've kind of lost out on that Italian edge that you get with white. Your knight on b3, what's that even doing there? Queen takes knight, a threat on the king. The queen takes pawn that you pointed out earlier would also threaten a checkmate in 1 on g2.
The computer is so evil, and so is Magnus Carlsen. Bishop takes a7, laughing in the face of danger, saying, "You know what? Wow. You take this discover check and put it where the sun don't shine." The big problem is that if Black moves the knight away with a check, let's take knight takes h3 as an illustration, White can actually push the pawn in Black's face, f4, hitting the queen, and earning a tempo for this bishop to evacuate. You can play knight takes f4, and after bishop to d4, White saves the extra piece. Alireza goes for a different intermezzo. He plays queen takes e4, hitting the bishop, hitting the mate, hitting the other bishop. But if Magnus just calmly defends against the mate threat, back to the tall coat, Tanya, you can only take one of my pieces at a time. Alireza will have to decide which of these bishops he's going to capture. And if he takes the one on a7, Magnus might have some devilish tactics with queen takes d6 and knight back to d2. I've got no clue what's going on here. Nope, bishop e3.
Yeah, because the bishop on a7 was hanging, so you don't have time really to take on d6, or maybe at least you had to calculate the idea that you were mentioning. But bishop e3, but you're down a pawn, right? Do you have enough compensation here? I see the opposite color bishop, but it just feels like if anyone can push here, it's got to be Black.
Black is up a pawn, and he's got the initiative. Magnus had an absolutely sick idea earlier on. He could have established material equality. I was trying to calculate it in my head, but it's too late for that. I'll show it in the game review. Right now, it's important to point out, not only is Alireza up a pawn, but look at his pieces, right? He's occupying these light squares. He's got Magnus's king in a very nasty little net, but Carlsen says, I am fighting. I'm fighting, I'm getting my own pieces active, and knight e4 is a nasty, nasty little move. d5 runs into knight d6, and it's Black who actually loses a piece in that scenario. Oh.
It's getting very complicated right now. So he hits
There's a knight f6 check that you have to be careful about. Watch out.
But in that position, you could probably take, because you always have this queen e5 check to defend everything, right, Daniel?
Yeah, I'm trying to make some of these bullet shenanigans work, and I'm failing. Magnus is pausing here because he's not automatically going to take on d6. He's probably thinking about a move like queen to d4. He's thinking about a well-timed sacrifice on f6. What am I even talking about? I'm looking at this position. Queen takes d6, Tanya. I'm going to put this on the board. Knight to c4. And now I was briefly calculating knight f6. The eval bar doesn't hate this move, because after queen to g3, king h8, bishop to d4, imagine having this position against Magnus Carlsen. I would be terrified. There's a mate threat. There's a rook coming into e1. So something for Magnus to calculate. Instead, he has gone for queen to d4, leaving this pawn for the knight, offering a queen trade. Alireza says, sure thing.
This is the point, right? You just go into an endgame now, and now Magnus has to try to hold this one, because he's not down just one pawn. He's down 2 pawns, and I see the compensation. It's around the dark squares. Those 2 pawns on the queen side that Magnus has, they stop the 3 pawns that you've got. The bishop on e3 is stronger than the bishop on c8 because of the pawn structure that you're highlighting. But Daniel, it still feels like Black can try to squeeze something here.
Listen, as Abraham Lincoln said, 2 extra pawns is 2 extra pawns. That was the preamble to the Gettysburg Address. Rook fb1, though, Magnus Carlsen is also Magnus Carlsen, and we know how good he is typically at holding these types of endgames. If I had the black pieces here against Magnus, I would be thinking about an exit ramp. I would be thinking about how to bail out into a draw, because the bishop is coming to c5, Tanya. Magnus is dominating these dark squares, and the knight is actually in quite a bit of trouble. If you drop back to c4, the rook can move up to b4 a little bit later, and defending the knight with bishop e6 would involve giving up the b7 pawn. This is a very important pawn, because if that pawn collapses, then you're saddled with 2 more weaknesses on the queen side. I'm going to make a bold prediction and claim that Magnus is actually potentially playing this position for a win.
And we saw him do that, right? In the rapid game where he was down 2 pawns in that crazy rook pawn ending. He was actually pushing for more eventually. And in these opposite color bishop complexes, it can get really tricky because the bishops can't be challenged. You're playing on so many of the squares that your opponent cannot defend. Look at the way Magnus places his rook on a dark square. Now the other rook will join the party either from b1 or from e1, trying to eye that e5 pawn. But first, Alireza has to answer an unpleasant question. Knight d2? He develops the bishop, but gives up a pawn on the way.
I thought that Magnus should have paused there because rook takes b7 wasn't the only move. He also had knight g5. I would have investigated some of these alternatives. There we go. h6 by Alireza. The opportunity train has passed. Now the knight on e4 doesn't have a clear path forward. Yet again, I love the way that Alireza handles these endgames. He's a phenomenal endgame player. And Magnus still trying to squeeze, to chisel his way through these dark squared weaknesses, also using Alireza's clock against him.
And the thing is that Magnus's last move actually offers a trade of the minor pieces, which would get rid of the opposite color bishop complex. Usually that would favor the side with the extra pawn. But this would allow the a pawn to move on to b6, which would make a really strong passer. And then I would agree with everything that you just said, that Magnus is going to start getting more than ambitious. Knight coming to c5, that pawn replacing the bishop on b6, the rook from a1 attacking a6. Only Magnus Carlsen can be better there.
That's the thing, right? There's the Magnus effect on full display. You could have 3 extra pawns and you're still going to believe that you're on the defensive. Alireza might very well be on the defensive. From a practical standpoint, I would be very seriously considering a bailout option with rook b8. It's on the board. And does Magnus keep the rooks on the board? Does he play rook c7 here? That would involve giving up another pawn. And more importantly, that would involve giving up the pride of his position, the bishop on b6. If I'm Carlsen, I'm contemplating rook takes b8 and knight c5. Of course, I'm not Magnus Carlsen, unfortunately. So I don't know what he's actually going to go for.
But everything that you just said right now, right? He's probably got to trade. And just as I say it, he doesn't. Magnus is going all out in this position. He's giving another pawn.
He's playing for the win. He's going to go knight c5. He's going to put all of his eggs in the piece activity basket. And that's a pretty good basket to put your eggs in because once the knight gets to c5, it hits the bishop. The bishop doesn't have too many safe squares to jump to. And king f8 runs into rook takes c6 and knight d7. So how easy is it to blunder when you've got just a couple of seconds left and your opponent's knight is wilding? Bishop to d5. Rook takes e5 by Carlsen.
He does regain a pawn, and it turns out to be an inaccuracy. But the fact that Magnus feels he has enough compensation here, to me, that's just amazing. And rook b5, that's a blunder.
There's also this cool tactic. Knight to d7 sets up the sort of semi-threat of rook takes a6. He just plays rook takes a6 straight away, and he wins the pawn bag, and suddenly material is equal. How did that happen? How is the pawn count even? Wasn't Alireza just up 2 pawns, potentially even 3?
Just 2 moves ago. It's the Magnus Carlsen effect. Rook d8 played. The material is level. White needs to defend the knight. White's rooks are more active right now. Daniel, how do you evaluate this ending? Do you think after all the material balance has been restored, Alireza can actually bail this out because it's simplified?
Yeah, because I think knight d3 runs into bishop takes f3. Knight e4 allows the bailout option with bishop takes e4. I think that we're going to get a peaceful result in the first game. This game has been anything but peaceful. If Magnus wants to stubbornly cling to chances of winning this game, then you play knight a4. You keep an imbalance on the board. But then you're clinging to chances of losing this game. And Tanya, knight a4, bishop takes f3 is actually still possible because when the pawn recaptures the rook, it hits the knight. So there's no reason for Magnus to do anything crazy. And they have agreed to a draw.
Wow. A draw offered and a draw accepted. And Alireza Firouzja isn't very happy with that. The one would feel that with